So you get this amazing change of royal ceremony in 1917, the deliberate democratization, above all the fact that royal princes, again, look at who they marry. Back in the 19th century, there'd have been no problem about a Fergie because he would have had to have married a German princess.
Precisely. And they would have been of a very similar ilk to Sarah
Or would have been
Ferguson
of a
as well.
similar ilk, but also, of course, there had been no nonsense about marital loyalty, marital fidelity. How silly! A marriage was a purely public convenience. But the problem is, at the same time, in 1917, the House of Windsor commits itself to being a moral middle-class monarchy.
And of course, Edward VIII comes along.
Then Edward VIII comes along. But remember, Edward VIII is got rid of very quickly.
Yeah, but what I found so interesting about Edward VIII is that I think all the perceptions of why he went are untrue. It wasn't for religious reasons.
No, well, it was.
It
depended who you looked at and who you talked to. There was a very broad general movement of resistance to Edward. One of the elements in it was Cosmo Gordon Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Cosmo Gordon Lang was at the heart of this moral monarchy. And what Lang was using, and many others were too, they were using the monarchy to try to enforce a rigorous view of Christian marriage. Remember, one of the great struggles of the earlier 20th century, indeed the late 19th, is the relaxation of divorce law. That up to almost till the end of the 19th century, you could only get divorced by an act of parliament.
Extraordinary.
Staggeringly expensive. You set up a divorce law reform commission, I think it's in 1904, but it's dominated by Cosmo Gordon Lang and a man called Anson, who was the Warden of All Souls at Oxford, again, Cosmo Gordon Lang, Fellow of All Souls, and the leading canon lawyer. And they fight for 25, 30 years to resist divorce law reform. And divorce law reform is only conceded after the abdication crisis. So there is a very strong religious element. Again, if you look at the BBC and the extraordinary role that it plays there, you will remember Reith, the Director General of the BBC, wanted to introduce Edward at his abdication broadcast as Mr. Windsor on the grounds that because he had failed his duty, his moral duty, he should be stripped of everything. And it's his brother who succeeds as George VI, who says, well, actually, no, he's born a royal prince. He will retain that and then gives him the ducal title. But there was this sense of, again, the House of Windsor is about duty. You'll remember, we've already been teasing references to Gilbert and Sullivan and whatever, but duty must be done. And the House of Windsor elevates this idea. Again, this strange notion of service.
Well, public service as well.
Public service, which you can, if you remember, it's the great mantra of Keir Starmer. And it's, again, very interesting to look at how closely related a lot of this actually is to socialism. The monarchy fitted with that kind of what everybody is now talking about, Fabian socialism, which is also highly imperialist at this point. I mean, the Webbs, Bernard Shaw, and so on, they are powerful imperialists. They think socialists can run an empire. To us, it seems very strange, but they actually do. And the monarchy's adjustment to the Labour Party, again, is one of the really striking things. And it is George V, very much aided by Stanley Baldwin, the Tory leader, who deliberately embraces that first Labour government. That first Labour government of the mid-1920s, a minority government. It hangs by a thread, but he sort of treats them as the grit in the oyster. Yeah. And what you've got to do is you've got to pult the silk of courtiership. They're all invited to Buckingham Palace. Now, of course, the wives of the miners' leaders, gosh, it's great. They shove themselves there in their corsets and their overtight shoes, and all the men dress up in their court dress, which in those days involves breeches. One person refused to turn up dressed like that, and it was, of course, the only middle-class member of the cabinet. It was Sidney Webb, and there's a wonderful interchange. I think it's true. If it's not true, it should be, between George V and J.H. Thomas, the great trade unionist, a bright and intelligent man.
Is there any other kind?
And very, very, I mean, he's the kind of Bevin figure of that period. And it's a wonderful story. The king says, Thomas, obviously calling him by his surname, Thomas, where is Mr. Webb? Why isn't he here? Oh, well, couldn't turn up, sir. And by the way, patting to his breeches. In that house, it's Beatrix what wears the breeches, George, having been a midshipman in the Navy and capable of swearing the hind legs off a donkey when necessary, was entirely able to cope. So again, it's the Windsor monarchy is this strangest thing in the Second World War, the way in which George VI embraces rationing. The story is told of his going round Buckingham Palace put with a ruler marking whatever it was, 3 inches or whatever of bathwater that you were allowed to have. There's a description by Eleanor Roosevelt of eating spam off gold plate. You had a monarchy that presents itself as service, that presents itself as a moral exemplar, the family monarchy. Again, I think it's very much part of, once you actually say in 1917 your children can marry Englishmen and English women, of course it then becomes a love affair. And with the peculiar Anglo-Saxon attitude to marriage, that marriage and love have got something to do with each other, you then find yourself in this grip. Now, it's fine if, like George VI and the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, you can actually do it, or, as we now gather, the Queen and Prince Philip, you can successfully pretend to do it, or at least to have a convention which enables you to do it. But once you get post-1960s, post-1970s, with the increasing liberalisation of divorce law, with also, I think, something very alarming, which is from the point of view of the monarchy, the notion of the need to speak out, the notion of authenticity. Now, that raises terribly difficult questions, doesn't it?
Well, but what was interesting is that Edward VIII was always trying to speak out. He made that remark about the miners, saying something must be done. Now, of course, that's a very anodyne remark, but that was seen as quite scandalous at the time. It was seen that he was actually getting involved in politics.
Well, again,
so you can't do that.
Well, yes and no. I mean, on the other hand, remember, I have no idea what your family's experience of that period was. It was appalling. If you were like my father in the north of England, had worked as highly skilled. He was a tool maker, like somebody else's father. He trained at what was then the world's largest factory at Platt Brothers on the borders of Oldham and Manchester, which made huge amounts of cotton machinery. And of course, the bottom falls out of the cotton trade with the crash of 29. He is unemployed from 31 to 35, and there is absolute minimum. There had to be the financial crash, the cutbacks of Neville Chamberlain, who's actually a brilliant Chancellor of the Exchequer, but it left people like him in a state of poverty that we cannot contemplate. And Edward was making that gesture. I think we've also got to remember with Edward is, I think the nearest figure to Edward is actually Princess Diana. He had that similar capacity for striking an image. I don't know whether you've looked at some of his earlier photographs. There's an extraordinary photograph. I think he's the first member of the royal family, I think, actually to go to Canada and America. And there's a photograph of him on a ranch, sitting open neck shirt. He's dazzlingly handsome.
Yeah.
Small but dazzling. He takes after his mother, Queen Alexandra of Denmark. I mean, she was Danish. The Danish. So of course, blue-eyed, blonde hair.
You can see that with the blonde hair and that very Aryan look.
Exactly. Why Chips Channon, wets himself over him. But the photograph of him, he's like a young Marlon Brando. I mean, he's wearing a cowboy hat on the back of his head. There's a fag hanging out of his mouth. He's sitting, legs very wide apart, on a fence. And this is the beginning of cinema.
Yeah.
There's that wonderful remark about the English: the monarchy are the nearest things we have to film stars. So again, that extraordinary awkward line between celebrity and monarchy. But again, like Princess Diana, he commands the camera. He's just like Diana. I'll complete the business of trying to justify my remark. He is again a fashion icon. He invents how men dress now. He invents the Prince of Wales check. He invents trousers with turn-ups. He invents soft-collared shirts. I mean, in the same way that his grandfather had invented the dinner jacket and the silk facings for evening wear. He is the person who really shapes how men still broadly look. If you look at a photograph of him in the 1920s, he would pass for a fashionably dressed man now. And it's really remarkable that he did that. So but again, George, the other way in which I think he connects us to all the Queen's children, apart from Prince Edward, is this emotional incontinence. He has to be happy.
And when he's not happy, things go wrong.
Well, he remember, a royal prince is supposed to marry for public reasons. I mean, again, when I talked about the marriage of, I talked about the first of those marriages of the 1920s, of Princess Mary, when the second son marries, that's to say, when Albert, who becomes, again with this change of names, Albert, who becomes George VI after the abdication, when he marries Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the sermon is given by the man we've been referring to, who's very close to them, Cosmo Gordon-Lang. And the sermon is genuinely, to our eyes, astonishing. This is in the Abbey. He turns to the young couple and says, this is actually said, express words, you cannot vow that your marriage will be happy. You will and shall vow that it will be noble. In the same way, when poor old Princess Margaret is required to give up Captain Townsend, the letter actually, her note, public press release, I'm doing it for the Empire. Laying down your love for the Empire.